The Weight of Words Unspoken. Chapter 1, September Light. The afternoon light in Cedar Ridge had a particular quality in September, golden and slanted, casting long shadows that reminded Margaret of the classroom she'd left behind 3 years ago. She watched it now through her kitchen window, illuminating the dust motes that danced above her manuscript pages, scattered across the small oak table like fallen leaves. At 58, Margaret had learned that solitude and loneliness were not the same thing, though the distinction had taken her divorce and subsequent retreat to this mountain village to fully understand. Solitude was the choice she made each morning when she brewed her single cup of coffee and opened her notebook to write. Loneliness was what she felt every other Thursday when the book club gathered at the community center, and David would arrive 5 minutes late, his graying hair tousled by the wind, carrying whatever novel had captured his imagination that month. She had been working on her own novel for 2 years now. A quiet story about a woman finding herself after loss. It wasn't autobiographical, she told herself, though the lie sat uncomfortably in her chest like an ill-fitting sweater. The phone rang, startling her from her reverie. "Margaret? It's Diane. Are you still planning to come tonight?" Margaret glanced at the calendar, though she knew perfectly well what Thursday meant. "Of course. What are we discussing again?" "The 7 Husbands of Evelyn Hugo. David's choice. He says it's about the masks we wear to survive." Diane's voice carried a hint of something. Amusement, perhaps, or knowing. "He's been quite passionate about it." After hanging up, Margaret sat for a long moment, watching the light fade from golden to amber. David's choices always revealed something about his inner world, and she had become an unwilling cartographer of his thoughts, mapping the terrain of his mind through the books he selected. Last month it had been Circe, transformation and power. Before that, normal people, the weight of unspoken connections. She wondered if he knew how closely she listened when he spoke about the characters he loved, how she filed away his observations like pressed flowers between the pages of her memory. Chapter 2, The Art of Listening. The Cedar Ridge Community Center smelled of coffee and old wood, its walls lined with watercolors painted by residents who had discovered art in retirement. Margaret arrived precisely on time, as was her habit, finding her usual seat in the circle of mismatched chairs. She had learned in her teaching years that punctuality was a form of respect, both for others and for herself. The group was small, just 6 regulars who had bonded over their shared love of stories. There was Diane, the librarian who had recommended Margaret for the group, Tom and Beverly, the retired engineers who read everything together, young Sarah, barely 30, who worked at the local cafe and devoured books with the hunger of someone still discovering who she might become, and David. David, who had moved to Cedar Ridge 5 years ago to write his 3rd novel in peace, though he seemed to find more inspiration in conversation than in solitude. David, who had never married, who spoke of his characters as if they were dear friends, who had a way of looking at people as if he were cataloging their stories for future use. "Margaret," he said as she settled into her chair, his smile warm and immediate. "I've been thinking about what you said last month, about Madeline Miller's use of perspective. You were absolutely right. The power lies in who gets to tell the story." She felt the familiar flutter in her chest, the dangerous pleasure of being seen by him, even if only as a mind worth engaging. "I've been a teacher too long," she said, deflecting as she always did. "I can't help but analyze everything." "That's what makes your insight so valuable," he replied, and she wondered if he could hear how those words landed in her heart like stones thrown into still water, creating ripples she couldn't control. As the discussion began, Margaret found herself studying David's hands as he gestured. The way his eyes lit up when he talked about Evelyn Hugo's reinvention, her careful construction of identity. There was something achingly beautiful about his enthusiasm, the way he leaned forward when making a point, completely present in the moment. "The thing about Evelyn," David was saying, "is that she understood the difference between being loved and being known. She spent her whole life performing love while protecting her authentic self. Margaret felt the words like a diagnosis. She thought of her own performance, the careful distance she maintained, the way she had learned to love him quietly, privately, like tending a garden no one else would ever see. But isn't that tragic? Sarah asked. All that performance, all that protection? When does it become a prison? David considered this, his fingers drumming against his coffee cup. Maybe prison is the wrong metaphor. Maybe it's more like conservation. Some things are too precious to expose to the elements. Their eyes met across the circle, and for a moment, Margaret wondered if he was speaking directly to her. Then Diane made a comment about the Hollywood setting, and the moment passed, leaving Margaret to wonder if it had existed at all. Chapter 3. The Geography of Hearts. Walking home after the meeting, Margaret took the long way, following the winding path that led past David's cabin. This had become a ritual she didn't quite admit to herself. These circuitous routes that happened to take her by his warm, glowing windows. Tonight, she could see him at his desk, bent over his laptop, lost in whatever world he was creating. She had read his first 2 novels, of course. They were beautiful, complex stories about people finding themselves in unexpected places. His protagonists were always younger than she was, always on the cusp of some great discovery about themselves or the world. She wondered sometimes if he saw her as someone whose discoveries were behind her, whose story was essentially finished. The path curved away from his cabin and back toward the main road, past the small cemetery where the town's founders rested beneath weathered headstones. Margaret paused here often, not from morbid fascination but from a recognition that these markers represented completed stories, finished narratives that had once been as uncertain and unfolding as her own. She thought about what David had said about conservation, about protecting precious things from the elements. Was that what she was doing with her love for him, preserving it by keeping it hidden? Or was she simply afraid that bringing it into the light would reveal how one-sided it truly was? Her phone buzzed with a text from her daughter in Denver. "Mom, are you happy there?" "Really happy." Margaret paused beneath a streetlight to type her response. "I'm learning to be." It wasn't entirely true, but it wasn't entirely false either. She was learning something in this mountain solitude, though she wasn't sure yet what to call it. Perhaps it was the difference between happiness and contentment, between being fulfilled and being complete. When she reached her cottage, she made her evening tea and returned to her manuscript. Her protagonist was facing a choice: whether to reveal her feelings to someone who might not return them, risking the comfortable friendship they had built. Margaret stared at the cursor blinking on the white page, waiting for her to decide what her character would do. Outside, the mountain night was settling in, bringing with it the particular silence that existed only in places where human sounds were outnumbered by natural ones. She had learned to love this silence, the way it created space for thoughts that might otherwise be drowned out by the noise of a busier life. Chapter 4. The Weight of Wednesdays. Wednesdays were for grocery shopping and the small errands that punctuated Margaret's carefully structured week. She had discovered, in retirement, that routine was not the enemy of creativity but its foundation. A steady rhythm against which the irregular beats of inspiration could play. At Morrison's Market, she moved through the familiar aisles with the efficient grace of someone who cooked for one and had made peace with it. She was selecting apples when she heard David's voice behind her. "Margaret!" What a pleasant surprise. She turned, and there he was with a basket containing what looked like the ingredients for a dinner party: wine, cheese, fresh bread, flowers. Her heart performed its familiar skip, followed immediately by the careful discipline she had learned to apply to such moments. "Planning something special?" she asked, proud of how casual she sounded. "My editor is visiting from New York. First time she's seen the mountain hideaway." He grinned, and she caught a glimpse of the boyish enthusiasm that made him so appealing. "I'm attempting to prove I haven't gone completely feral living up here." Margaret laughed. genuine amusement mixing with the sharper pain of being reminded that David's life contained entire landscapes she would never see. "I'm sure you'll be the perfect host." "Actually," he said, and something in his tone made her look at him more carefully, "I was wondering if you might have any advice. You always seem to know the right thing to do, the graceful way to handle situations." There it was again. His view of her as wise, experienced, safely maternal. The woman who knew the right thing to do. Not the woman who lay awake at night imagining conversations they would never have. "What kind of advice?" she asked. "She's been pushing me to write something more contemporary, more connected to current issues, but I keep feeling drawn to quieter stories, internal landscapes." He ran his hand through his hair, a gesture she had seen him make dozens of times during book club discussions. "I suppose I'm wondering how you balance external expectations with internal truth." The question was so direct, so unexpectedly personal, that Margaret felt momentarily dizzy. Here was David, asking her about the very thing she struggled with most, the tension between what others expected and what the heart demanded. "I think," she said slowly, "that the most honest writing comes from the places we're afraid to examine too closely. The quiet stories matter because they're often the ones we live inside of, even when the world is demanding something louder." He nodded thoughtfully. "That's exactly what I needed to hear. You have such a gift for clarity, Margaret. I don't know how you do it." After he left, Margaret stood in the produce section for several minutes, holding an apple she had forgotten to put in her bag. A gift for clarity. If only he knew how murky her own internal landscape had become, how she had to wade through layers of careful self-deception just to have these simple conversations with him. Chapter 5. The Season of Letting Go. October arrived with its usual pageantry, turning the mountains into a symphony of color that tourists drove hours to witness. Margaret had always loved autumn, but living in Cedar Ridge had given her a deeper appreciation for the season's essential message, that there could be beauty in release, grace in knowing when to let go. She was raking leaves in her small yard when Sarah from the book club appeared at her garden gate, looking uncharacteristically nervous. "Margaret, do you have a few minutes?" Over tea in Margaret's kitchen, Sarah fidgeted with her cup handle and avoided eye contact. "I need to ask you something, and I hope you won't think I'm being presumptuous." "Of course, dear. What is it?" "It's about David." Sarah's cheeks flushed pink. I was wondering if you'd noticed. Do you think he might be interested in someone? Romantically, I mean." Margaret's hand stilled on her teacup. "What makes you ask?" "He's been different lately. More thoughtful, I guess. And he asked me about you the other day. Whether you'd ever been married if you were happy living alone. I thought maybe." Sarah trailed off, looking embarrassed. "I thought maybe he was interested in you." The words hit Margaret like cold water. For a moment, she allowed herself to feel the full force of hope. Dangerous, unwieldy hope that she had worked so hard to keep contained. Then reality reasserted itself. "Sarah, I think you might be misreading the situation. David and I are friends. Good friends. But he's 13 years younger than I am, and I'm quite sure his interest in my personal life is purely friendly concern. But age doesn't always matter. It matters when it matters," Margaret said gently. "And I suspect David's questions about me had more to do with his writer's curiosity about people's stories than any romantic interest." Sarah looked unconvinced but didn't press the point. After she left, Margaret sat in her kitchen as the afternoon light faded, examining the small wound Sarah's question had opened. She had been so careful to keep her feelings buried, but apparently, her care for David was more visible than she'd realized. That evening, she called her daughter. "Emma? It's Mom. Hey, what's up? You sound strange." Margaret considered how to explain what she was feeling without revealing too much. "I've been thinking about something you asked me, about whether I'm really happy here. And I think I've been confusing safety with happiness. They're not the same thing. What do you mean? Margaret looked out her window at the lights scattered across the mountainside, each one representing someone's private life, their secret joys and sorrows. I mean, I've been so focused on protecting myself from disappointment that I've forgotten how to be open to possibility. That sounds like a good realization, Mom. I'm not sure yet, Margaret said. It might just be the prelude to making some very foolish choices. After hanging up, she returned to her manuscript. Her protagonist was still facing the same choice Margaret had left her with weeks ago. Tonight, for the first time, Margaret let her character speak the truth that had been building in her heart like pressure in a closed system. The words appeared on the screen. I need to tell you something, and I need you to know that I don't expect anything in return. This is not about changing what we have. It's about honoring what I feel. Margaret stared at the sentence for a long time before saving the file and closing her laptop. Chapter 6. November Confessions. The first snow came early that year, dusting the mountains with premature winter. Margaret watched it from her kitchen window while making her morning coffee, struck by how it transformed the familiar landscape into something both beautiful and slightly treacherous. The book club was meeting at David's cabin for November. His suggestion, since he wanted to share his favorite reading spot with the group. Margaret had walked past his home so many times but had never been inside. The thought of seeing his private space, the place where he created his stories, filled her with a mixture of anticipation and unease. His cabin was warm and cluttered in all the right ways. Books stacked on every surface, papers scattered across a large wooden table, the scent of coffee and wood smoke creating an atmosphere of comfortable productivity. Margaret found herself cataloging details like a detective. The photograph of David with an older couple who must be his parents, the collection of fountain pens in a ceramic cup, the way the afternoon light fell across his reading chair. Welcome to Chaos Central, David said, appearing at her elbow with a cup of coffee. I apologize for the mess. I've never been good at the work-life balance thing when I'm deep in a project. It feels like a writer's space, Margaret replied. Lived in and productive. Is that a polite way of saying disorganized? It's a way of saying authentic. He smiled at that, and Margaret felt the familiar warmth of his approval. They were discussing Clara and the Sun that evening, Ishiguro's meditation on love, sacrifice, and the mystery of human connection. As the conversation unfolded, Margaret found herself thinking about artificial intelligence learning to love, about the strange territory between programmed response and genuine feeling. What strikes me, David was saying, is how Clara's love is so pure because it asks for nothing in return. She loves Josie completely, selflessly, without any expectation of reciprocation. But is that really love? Tom interjected. Or is it devotion? There's a difference. Margaret set down her coffee cup. I think the difference is in choice. Clara chooses to love, even knowing her love might not be returned or even fully understood. That's what makes it real. David turned to look at her, something shifting in his expression. You think unrequited love can be as authentic as mutual love? The question hung in the air like incense, heavy with implications Margaret wasn't sure she was ready to breathe in. I think, she said carefully, that love doesn't require an object to validate its existence. Sometimes loving someone is its own complete experience. The conversation moved on, but Margaret caught David watching her several more times throughout the evening, as if he were trying to decode something in her words. After the others left, Margaret lingered, helping David clear away the coffee cups and straighten the chairs. The intimacy of the domestic task, working quietly together in his space, felt both natural and charged with significance. Margaret, he said as she was putting on her coat, can I ask you something? Her heart began its familiar acceleration. Of course. Your novel, the one you're working on. What's it about? Really? The question caught her off guard. She had mentioned her writing only in passing, never expecting him to remember or care about her small creative efforts. "It's about a woman learning to live with herself," she said. "Learning to find meaning in a life that looks different than she expected it to. That sounds like a story worth telling. I'm not sure I'm brave enough to tell it properly." David studied her face in the lamplight. "I think you're braver than you know, Margaret. There's something about you. A kind of quiet strength. I've always admired that." Walking home through the snow, Margaret felt as if something fundamental had shifted between them, though she couldn't name what it was. His words echoed in her mind. Quiet strength. Not wisdom, not maternal guidance, but strength. As if he saw her not just as someone who had already figured everything out, but as someone still in the process of becoming. Chapter 7. December Decisions. The second week of December brought an invitation that changed everything. David called on a Tuesday evening, his voice carrying an unusual nervousness. "Margaret, I know this is last minute, but I'm having a small holiday gathering this Saturday. Nothing fancy, just some friends, good food, maybe some terrible Christmas music. Would you like to come?" Margaret found herself agreeing before she had time to analyze all the reasons she should decline. It was only after hanging up that she realized this would be different from their book club meetings. Social rather than intellectual, a glimpse into David's world beyond their shared love of literature. She spent the rest of the week in a state of anticipation that felt both foolish and inevitable. At 58, she thought she had outgrown this kind of nervous excitement, but apparently the heart had its own timeline, independent of chronological age. Saturday evening found her standing in front of her closet, trying to strike the right balance between effort and casualness. She settled on a deep blue sweater that Emma had given her for her birthday, paired with her best jeans and the silver earrings her ex-husband had given her during one of their happier years. David's cabin was transformed, warm with candlelight and filled with laughter. Margaret recognized some faces from town: the postmaster, the woman who ran the bookstore, a couple of other writers who lived seasonally in the area. The atmosphere was relaxed and welcoming, and Margaret found herself settling into conversations with an ease that surprised her. She was talking with Linda, the bookstore owner, about the challenges of promoting literary fiction when David appeared beside them. "Ladies, I hate to interrupt, but Margaret, could I steal you for a moment? I want to show you something." He led her through the cabin to a small room she hadn't seen before. His study, lined with books and featuring a large window that looked out over the valley. Snow was falling steadily now, creating a sense of enclosure and intimacy. "This is where I do most of my writing," he said. "But I brought you here because I wanted you to see this." He gestured to his desk, where Margaret was surprised to see a copy of her favorite poetry collection, Mary Oliver's American Primitive, along with several other books she had mentioned during their conversations over the months. "You listen," she said, touched by this evidence of his attention. "I do listen. Especially to you." He turned to face her fully, and something in his expression made her breath catch. "Margaret, I need to ask you something, and I hope you'll forgive me if I'm completely wrong about this." She waited, not trusting herself to speak. "That night at book club when we were talking about Clara's love, the way you spoke about unrequited love being authentic, complete in itself. Were you speaking theoretically, or?" He paused, running his hand through his hair in the gesture she had come to love. "Were you speaking from experience?" Margaret felt the moment crystallizing around them, all her careful defenses suddenly as fragile as spun glass. She could lie, deflect, protect herself as she had been doing for months, or she could honor the truth that had been building in her chest like music demanding to be sung. "David," she said quietly, "I'm 58 years old. I'm divorced, set in my ways, probably past the age where romantic confession is supposed to be dignified or appropriate. But yes, I was speaking from experience." He stepped closer, close enough that she could see the flecks of gold in his brown eyes. "What if I told you that age doesn't matter to me? That dignity is overrated? that some of the most beautiful things in life happen when we're brave enough to be inappropriate. Margaret felt something inside her shift, like ice breaking up on a spring river. I would say that sounds like something one of your characters might say. My characters are usually braver than I am, he admitted. But not tonight. When he kissed her, it was gentle and questioning, a conversation rather than a declaration. Margaret had forgotten that kisses could be like this, exploratory, patient, full of possibility rather than demand. When they broke apart, she pressed her forehead against his. "This is terrifying," she whispered. "Good terrifying or bad terrifying? I haven't decided yet." He laughed, and the sound was warm and intimate in the small room. Outside, the snow continued to fall, and Margaret thought about Clara's pure, selfless love, and about the difference between devotion and choice, and about how sometimes the most authentic thing you can do is admit you don't know what comes next. Chapter 8. January Thaw. The new year brought an unexpected warm spell that melted most of the snow and filled the mountain air with the scent of wet earth and possibility. Margaret sat at her kitchen table, not with her manuscript this time, but with a cup of coffee and David's latest chapter. He had asked her to read his work in progress, a development that felt as intimate as any physical gesture. His novel was about a woman in her 50s discovering that her life was not finished, that she was not a completed story, but an ongoing narrative with chapters yet to be written. Margaret smiled as she read, recognizing the conversations they had shared, the insights she had offered, now transformed into fiction. They had been seeing each other for a month now, a relationship that felt both startlingly new and comfortingly familiar. David had been right about age not mattering, or rather, he had been right that it didn't matter in the way she had feared it would. Instead, her years of experience had become assets rather than liabilities, her hard-won self-knowledge a gift she could offer rather than a burden she carried. There had been awkward moments, of course. The first time David stayed the night, Margaret had woken before dawn in a panic, convinced she had imagined their entire connection. The first time they attended a town event together, she had felt every curious glance like a spotlight, wondering what people thought about the older woman and the younger man. But David had a way of grounding her when her insecurities surfaced. "Margaret," he had said one evening when she was spiraling about their age difference, "do you think less of couples where the man is older than the woman?" "Of course not." "Then why hold yourself to a different standard?" It was such a simple question, but it had cut through months of self-doubt with startling efficiency. Her phone buzzed with a text from Emma. "Mom, you sound different when we talk lately. Happier. What's changed?" Margaret typed back. "I'm learning that it's never too late to surprise yourself." This was true in ways beyond her relationship with David. Her novel had begun flowing again, her protagonist finally making the choices Margaret herself was learning to make. More surprisingly, she had agreed to substitute teach at the local elementary school, just a few days a week, but enough to remind her that retirement didn't have to mean withdrawal from the world. David's chapter ended with his protagonist standing at her kitchen window, watching the sunrise and realizing that what she had taken for an ending was actually a beginning. Margaret smiled, recognizing her own morning ritual in the description. Her phone rang. "David, what did you think?" he asked without preamble. "I think you've captured something true about the strangeness of starting over." "Good strange or bad strange?" Margaret laughed, hearing the echo of their conversation from that snowy December night. "Definitely good strange. Want to celebrate? I was thinking dinner at that new place in town. Or we could cook something here. Or we could just take a walk and see where we end up." "Yes," Margaret said. "Yes to which option?" "Yes to all of it. Yes to seeing where we end up." After hanging up, Margaret returned to her own manuscript. Her protagonist was facing a new chapter now, one that Margaret was finally ready to write. Outside her window, the mountain was showing its first hints of spring, not the dramatic transformation of autumn or the stark beauty of winter, but the subtle, persistent emergence of new life from ground that had seemed barren just weeks before. Margaret understood now that this was how change really happened, not in sudden revelations but in quiet accumulations, each small choice building towards something larger. She had spent so many months thinking of herself as someone whose story was essentially over, whose role was to witness other people's adventures from a safe distance. But perhaps, she thought as she began to write, the most radical act at any age was to remain open to surprise, to resist the narrative of completion in favor of the ongoing possibility of becoming. Perhaps the true gift of experience was not knowing how the story ended, but knowing that it didn't have to end at all. Epilogue. October again. A year later, Margaret stood in her kitchen making coffee for two, watching the familiar September light that had first drawn her attention to the cycle of seasons in Cedar Ridge. David was at the table, editing her completed novel. She had finally found the courage to let him read it, and his enthusiasm had given her the confidence to submit it to publishers. The book club was meeting that evening to discuss The Seven Husbands of Evelyn Hugo again. David's choice, he said, because he wanted to revisit the themes of performance and authenticity with fresh eyes. Margaret suspected he simply enjoyed watching her face when they talked about love that transcended conventional expectations. This scene here, David said, tapping her manuscript, where she decides to speak honestly for the first time, it's beautiful. Terrifying and beautiful. I had a good teacher, Margaret replied, pouring his coffee. Who? Life, she said, kissing the top of his head. And maybe you. Outside, the mountains were beginning their annual transformation, and Margaret thought about cycles, not as repetitions but as spirals, each turn bringing you back to familiar territory from a slightly different angle, with different eyes to see what had always been there. She had learned, in this year of unexpected love and rediscovered purpose, that the stories we tell ourselves about our limitations are often more fiction than the novels we write. That it was possible to be both wise and naive, experienced and surprised, settled and still becoming. David looked up from her pages and smiled. Ready for another Thursday night adventure? Margaret smiled back, feeling the familiar flutter of anticipation, no longer tempered by the fear of disappointment, but enhanced by the knowledge that some adventures were worth the risk, no matter when in life they arrived. I'm ready, she said, and meant it in every possible way.